Today we are going to discussing some of the other incompatibilities between the modern state and Islamic governance, and especially the subjects produced by the two. And then we will also look at globalization, how that has worked within the institution of modern state and whether that has decreased the power of modern state or not. And then I will conclude the book. So we are going to be discussing chapter 5, 6 and 7 of the impossible state. So let's start with chapter 5, the political subject and moral technologies of the self. And its first section is the production of state subjects. So Halak says that, like everything else we have discussed so far, the form of discipline produced by the state was unique, geared towards creating a subject who was willing to die for it. In Europe, powerful monarchs wanted to tighten their hold over their population, and they sponsored colonial ventures which brought a lot of wealth, which later helped in industrialization. Cities grew faster, poverty and inequality increased, and this caused the rise of mob violence and unruly population, which in turn induced the state to introduce an organized police apparatus and prison system. Only physical force was not enough. So school system was introduced to educate the subjects to be obedient to the state and to develop the ability to work and produce. So learning moved away from church and family to the state. Still, poverty was increasing and so the discontent of the public. So the state welfare system began to be established, creating a social safety net, and so the public health institutions and hospitals were established. Regulations were applied to these institutions for disciplining the operations of the body for the purpose of submission and utility as materially productive. The body was now the site of empirical analysis. This training and discipline was external as it came from the state, not from inside the subject. And it falsely resembles ascetic training, but ascetic training lies in holding in low regard utility as a materialist performance. So now it is no longer a monarch that governs, but the bureaucratic and state-based institutions. As it is said, power shared is power increased. Academia plays a very important role in all of this. It prides itself on the intellectual independence and conducting research and generating knowledge through the so-called scientific method. Paradigmatic academia is a state institution as it adopts the positivism of the state. It accepts the state as a taken for granted phenomena and the role it plays in state governance. Academia helps the state identify problems and propose solutions so that the state is presented as a problem-solving machine. But many things that were normal in the pre-modern organic societies only became problems after the existence of the state. The state is not an organic society, and those organic societies did perfectly well without states, which is precisely why the state never made an appearance until Europe invented it. So the problems created due to the existence of the state caused the state to claim legitimacy by solving them. Academia seeks to develop among individuals the expertise in fields relevant to the interest of the state. The education in the modern state is a field that takes care of the subject during the most crucial formative period of his life. It instills in the child skills and knowledge of utility and efficiency, of the love for the homeland and its goodness. The citizen to the state is like blood to the body. Now, the modern state looks at family not as a sacred unit, but as a production unit whose job is to produce good national citizens. Through different institutions, the state enters the family life. The family loses autonomy and becomes a part of state's disciplinary system. The state thus creates the realm of the social, where society unfolds in the image of the state. Now, alongside all this, nationalism grew and it worked together with these things like patriotic speeches, ethno-national literature, public festivals, and much else of the sort existed in history, but these were given new meanings in the modern nation state, and they were used to enhance the subordination of the subject. Nationalism constructs the lens through which the subjects see themselves as a certain citizen and a part of a particular nation, and others like that as well. Nationalism is the main source of meaning available to the subjects before anything else. They see themselves belonging to a certain nation and can die for that constructed identity. Nationalism is a metaphysics which gives its subjects a particular worldview and meaning, and this nationalism and the state are two gods in one. Halak says that the modern state also trains people to value efficiency, productivity, calculation, and material success. This kind of training creates what Max Weber called the iron cage, where people feel free, but their choices are limited by money, work, rules, and so on. So the system leaves no room for spirituality and deep moral self-care. Modern people are taught to simply know themselves in technical way in terms of their skills, productivity, usefulness. Morality comes from external laws and state rules. Now society prefers specialists over morally cultivated isolated individuals. Work becomes an end in itself and not the means. This causes disenchantment, a deep sense of loss, the loss of the sacred, and this creates emotionally poor, isolated, and fragmented individuals. Nationalism and state affiliated identities become the cure for these problems that delude the citizens into a sense of containment. This is why nationalism is important for modern state. But like any modern treatment, this cure, nationalism, also has side effects. It has given rise to the 20th and 21st centuries genocides and atrocities. Humanity no longer worships gods but rather itself as a transcendental nation. Allah says we become nationalized narcissists. So the second section is the moral technologies of the self. The European experience that generated the modern state and the subsequent subject is just that, European and not Islamic. In Europe, politics controlled the law, while in Islamic governance, legislative was not the product of the political. Muslims lived 4,000 years under a system that was more egalitarian and merciful. Islamic governance did not have massive police systems, large prison networks, and constant surveillance. To a pre-modern Muslim, they would have looked terrifying and cruel. Islamic governance did not tamper with education, which remained not only private but also non-formal and highly accessible. Skills were largely devoid of political ideological content. The capabilities of political power to produce subjectivities that would recognize themselves in their power did not exist. Now, modern philosophy asks why be moral? And this question presupposes a particular state of affairs where the moral is not to be taken as a matter of course. The pre-modern Islamic tradition never asked this question. This question is modern, arising from and assuming the modern condition. In Sharia, law and morality were not separate. Allah says that when modern scholars study Sharia, they impose foreign vocabulary like law, morality, religion onto it, and this distorts the understanding of reality. The distinction between the legal and the moral constituted the subject of Islamic law, and this law was seen by Western scholars as a failure, which failed to distinguish between the legal and the moral. They found this law incomprehensibly deficient, which depended on morality for enforcement. Instead of understanding Islamic history on its own terms, scholars reshaped it to fit modern ideas and standards. How did Sharia create moral human beings? Sharia did not invent morality. It enlisted the social morality in its own service and systematized it, turning it into a legal moral system. Sharia assumed that people were already moral agents. The law took the presence of the moral force for granted. Without moral subjects, Sharia would have been meaningless. Allah says that Sharia functioned through a deep interaction between legal doctrine and morally formed Muslim subjects. This interaction is especially clear in ritual practices which were never disconnected from real social life. Morality learned through these rituals reinforced moral behavior in all other legal areas. Western scholarship saw Sharia's legal domain as comprising of two main parts: muamalat relating to law proper and ibadat relating to man's relationship with God, clearly a religious set of practices. Allah says that the segregation of the ritual ibadat from the legal muamalat was and continues to be a function of overlooking the moral force of the law. So these two parts, muamalat and ibadat, are closely linked, as Allah says. Islamic legal works always started with ritual laws, not just for symbolic reasons but to psychologically and morally prepare everyone to the law that followed. The second part of these works was about contractual and pecuniary subjects or family law. Then was the part about offenses against life and limb. The last part usually treated adjudication and rules of evidence and procedure and often included an exposition on jihad. So the prayer is placed first in Islamic law because it physically and spiritually trains the submission to God, and fasting cultivates compassion, humility, and gratitude. Zakat produces empathy and moral accountability towards society, and pilgrimage, Hajj, completes this moral formation. Sharia cannot function without the moral community, and the five pillars generate the moral force that enables willing obedience to law. Removing rituals from fiqh destroys the law's effectiveness, as was the case with colonial misunderstandings. The double shahada establishes belief but lies outside practical laws, while purification, tahara, and intention, niyyah, ensure that worship remains meaningful and not mechanical. Prayer begins early in life to form the moral subject before legal responsibility begins. Zakat extends discipline to wealth, fasting trains bodily and social restraint, and Hajj seals the entire moral program. Together, these practices constitute the moral foundation of Sharia and make that law operative without coercive state power. Imam Ghazali offers a powerful model of self-care that can be taken as a commentary on what later Foucault called technologies of the self. Ghazali's life reflected the practice of Islam in its Shari'i, Sufist, and philosophical manifestations. Just like modern age is overshadowed by Kantianism, the several centuries of Islam were overshadowed by Ghazalianism. Ghazali's work rests on what we now call a theory of human nature, which says that humans are not inherently good or bad, but pliable. Inside every human, there are four potential entities: aggressive, sab'iyya, beastly, bahimiyya, satanic, shaitaniya, and divine, rabbaniya. Anger, animosity, violence, and courage are the preserves of aggressive, greed, gluttony, caution, and lustfulness of the beastly, deception, lying, and trickery of the satanic, and knowledge, intellect, gnosis, and understanding of the divine. Each human being enjoys a certain measure of these four potentialities. The human potentiality of divine was bestowed with the power to exercise absolute mastery over all the others. The first three, aggressive, beastly, and satanic, are located in the sphere of soul, nafs, whereas the divine potentiality resides in the sphere of heart, qalb. Knowledge and intellect inhabit the qalb. If the desire becomes too strong, the soul becomes corrupt. But if the intellect and heart control the soul, the person improves morally. Ghazali explains the three stages of soul derived from Quran: al-nafs al-ammara, rebellious soul; then al-nafs al-lawwama, self-blaming soul; and then al-nafs al-mutma'inna, which is peaceful soul. Desire for food and sex leads to love for wealth and power, which breeds moral corruption. Ethical conduct is learned through training, repetition, and education, which gradually shapes the soul. At the core of all this training lies the love of God. A virtuous act is done willingly or with pleasure or with love. So the Homo modernus is antithetical to this Homo moralis. Homo modernus has come to inhabit the world that recognizes very little other than the political, and he sees the world as it is, admitting power and might as a sole logic and law of social political relations. Now let's move on to chapter 6, believing globalization and moral economy. So in this chapter we'll talk about the globalization and the Islamic economic system. So Halak says that let us suppose the Islamic governance has been fully established and the minimal conditions for its creation have been satisfied, including the following: the establishment of divine sovereignty, robust separation of powers where the legislative is fully independent, law and morality are inseparable without the separation of is and ought or fact and value, the executive is limited to the implementation of legislative will and issues temporary and small-scale administrative regulations. Law serves the community and promotes justice and equality. Education is independent of the state. Education asks and answers questions about the meaning of good life, and science and humanity serve moral growth. The concept of citizen is metamorphosed into the concept of moral community, and there is no concept of sacrifice for the state. Individuals practice the art of caring for the self. Now the first part. So if we suppose the coming into existence of such a state, we must also suppose that this governance has to live in a community of modern states and has to be acknowledged by the nation states, no matter how much its wealth and strong may differ from these states. But there is a new power relationship that has been dominating, which is globalization. Globalization is not just an economic phenomenon, but it is political and cultural as well. And it is clear that markets and economics that control and direct this massive movement towards globalization are capitalist, and it is the project of the rich and powerful liberal states and corporations. The founding ideology and operative mode of globalization comport with the ideology of the modern state. Now, political and international relations theory have debated this question of the relationship between globalization and the state, dividing itself among two main theses. One is that globalization weakens the state and that state is losing its autonomy, and the second is that state remains powerful and independent. So we have three schematic possibilities: the total victory of globalization, the total victory of the state, or a complex and continuous dialectic of both friction and cooperation between the two. In the foreseeable future, neither victory seems likely, leaving us with the third possibility, which is largely the present reality on the ground. Allah says that if Islamic governance is incompatible with the modern state, it is even less compatible with globalization or any hybrid of the two. Globalization has come to mean several things, but three aspects are discussed in the book: cultural, political, and economic. Culturally, new media and technology have taken away some of the monopoly of the state in the production of culture and cultural forms. But instead of protecting legal traditions, globalization mostly spreads Western lifestyles like food, clothing, entertainment, etc. Politically and militarily, globalization is not separate from the state. Powerful states drive globalization through military strength and political dominance. The modern Western state has effectively become a global form of state power. Shaw argues that globalization is as much a political and military force as it is an economic one in terms of importance, and these multi-powers represent the continuing dominance of the West over more or less the entire world. Economically, globalization is most powerful. Global trade markets and finance have expanded massively. Unlike states, globalization has no system for dealing with social justice and wealth redistribution. The state, however impoverished its record, has been more attentive than globalization in this respect. Globalized free markets are the work of the state. One prominent example of state's role is state-related and state-regulated corporations that play a central role in globalized economy. The corporate is created by law for one purpose, and that is to increase its wealth. And even when it talks about social responsibility, it is just another strategy to make more money. The corporation has failed to address the human needs of its citizens, and it also has been notorious in its inhumane and exploitative practices, destroying the lives of people. So in the end, globalization has not weakened the state. Most features remain strong or even have grown. Globalization globalization has no real sovereignty of its own. It has minimalistic power to exercise legitimate violence compared to the state. Its legislative competence is limited, and its potency as an autonomous agency to permeate cultural domain is still in its infancy. The educational and the larger cultural spheres remain penetrated by and under the direct control of the nation state. So now let's look at Islamic economy. Just as modern liberal economics rests on a certain conception of the world and a particular form of political life, so does Islam's economy, which was Shari'i in nature. While capitalism treats wealth accumulation as an end in itself, Islam embeds economic activity within a moral framework shaped by the Quran, prophetic teachings, and the centuries of legal tradition. Islamic society had been structured and was made to operate according to the five kulliyat, universals. These universals captured the essence of Islamic system. These universals were protection and promotion of wealth and property, protection of life, protection of religion, protection of mind, and protection of community. Universal of protecting life, nafs included criminal compensatory damages and agnates right, but not the states, to seek monetary damages, choose capital punishment, or grant pardon. Protection of religion, deen, is promoted by technologies of the self as well as through the laws of jihad and apostasy. Protection of mind or rational faculty, aql, is brought about through various regulations and such laws that prohibit the consumption of inebriants. Protection of community, nasl, is achieved by the laws regulating marriage, illicit sexual relationships, divorce, inheritance, custody, and the like. These universals were interdependent, so whenever one of the universals were involved for action, elements belonging to the entire set of the universals were put in motion. Now, seeking material wealth and accumulation of capital was encouraged in Islam and Sharia. The Prophet himself was a business manager and a trader. The Quran likewise declared trade and business to be legitimate activities once the religious duty to pray is discharged. The Sharia has also come to possess elaborate rules and regulations for sale, contract, and trade. All contractual transactions under the Sharia are imbued with moral values. To be valid, contracts must presuppose riza, a wholehearted consent devoid of any trace of coercion or even reluctance. Trade is suspicious if conducted within a market in which property and money have been corrupted by malpractices, whether these involve misappropriation, risk, or riba, which is charging usury. It was a presumption that in every sale there is a potential of an ism, sin, a moral liability, and for this one has to engage in charity. Even earning a living to support oneself and one's family and to pay one's debts is religious obligation, fard. Earning beyond this basic level is recommended, mustahab. It is also permissible, mubah, to engage in business ventures that may yield large fortunes, but this permissibility rests upon the condition of honesty, good faith, and fair dealings. It should be noted furthermore that all wealth is always assumed to belong to God, and the poor are seen to have a natural right to a part of the wealth of the rich. So lawful earning must fulfill all the following conditions. The income must be conceived as coming from God and His grace. No excessive effort should be expended in acquiring wealth, but to be a better moral subject. No creature of God may be harmed in the process. So acquisition of wealth is regulated and subordinated to higher moral principles that place qualitative constraints on it. So social justice is one of the constitutive and central features of Islam's moral economy. So within a globalized capitalism, Islamic governance would progressively weaken, becoming less and less competitive, resulting in economic and other social and political problems. The severity of challenges in any such system is undeniable. Now the last chapter, the central domain of the moral. So Halak gives the summary of some of the major incompatibilities between Islamic governance and the modern state, which has been discussed so far. First, the state is an anthropocentric and positivist. The state possesses and displays a metaphysics of the here and now, and what is for the state is its truth of will, its will to power. By contrast, no form of Islamic governance can permit positivism. If moral autonomy must lead, then metaphysics must necessarily transcend the narrow domain of positivist anthropocentrism. Second, Islamic governance cannot permit any sovereignty or sovereign will other than that of God, while the state has its own sovereignty. Third, the modern separation of powers undermines true rule of law, something which Islamic governance cannot accept, as it regulates human behavior by rules and regulations derived from higher moral principles. Fourth, the modern state produces subjects that differ from those produced by Islamic governance in profoundly political, social, moral, epistemic, and psychological ways. The state produces a subject focused on efficiency, nationalism, and sacrifice for the nation, while Islam produces a moral subject oriented towards goodness and responsibility. It is said, it is not the duty of the state to make us good, that is our business. Fifth, the modern state depends on and promotes a homo economicus whose exclusive and ultimate desideratum is material profit and nothing else, while the homo economicus of Islam is subordinated to a higher moral imperative, and even when he seeks wealth and profit, he remains materially and psychologically committed to social responsibility. The modern subject will find the true Muslim homo economicus a curiosity, something belonging to the museum of extinct species, while the Muslim homo economicus would similarly regard his modernist counterpart as irrational, greedy, short-sighted, and selfish, in short, a brute. Now the second section, a way out. Allah says that the modern state sits uncomfortably and problematically in the Muslim and much of Afro-Asian world, but modernity as a whole sits problematically in the entirety of the world. Modern life has produced moral emptiness, environmental destruction, broken communities, and many other problems, and these are essentially moral problems because they ultimately stem from a distortion of our moral vision of nature, and because only through implementing a correction to this vision can these problems be solved in satisfactory and genuine ways. The Enlightenment distinction between is and ought has profoundly shaped modernity's prevalent conception of the moral. When matter is stripped of all value, it can be treated as an object. This distinction created another effect, the isolation of reason from reasons, where the reason is obviously the tool of thinking, and reasons represent the causes that generate thought through reason. Reason became a mere thinking tool, while reasons, which are the moral reasons that move us to act, were ignored. Reason was treated as autonomous, self-sufficient, and expected to create morality on its own. This idea is central to modern moral philosophy, especially in Kant's view that morality must be justified by self-legislating reason. The world is now seen as morally silent, and reason dismisses moral reasons and recognizes nothing beyond itself. Philosophers like Pritchard and Larmor argued that we cannot reason our way to morality. Moral truths are not the things we prove logically, they are the things we directly recognize through moral awareness. Reason cannot be autonomous because, in order for its dormant potential to be realized, it must be activated, and this can happen only by responding to reasons. Reason is not an agent, it does not act or command, it is only a faculty we use. A principle is rational only if there are reasons that support it. Reason is receptive, not creative. Larmor could conclude that the only way to acknowledge the authority of morality is to focus at the outset on the fact that an other's good is in itself a reason for an action on my part. Moral responsibility does not come from valuing myself first and then extending that value to others. Larmor says that there should be autonomy of morality, means that the morality forms an autonomous, irreducible domain of value into which we cannot reason ourselves from without, but which we must simply acknowledge. But the problem is, how do we define these reasons concretely? These modern philosophical questions closely resemble debates that Muslim scholars had more than 1000 years ago. Muslim thinkers debated morality, its independence, and the role of reason. The debates covered somewhat similar positions to a modern Kantian, anti-Kantian, and irrationalist views. But the Enlightenment thinkers lived in a disenchanted world, while Muslims lived in a more or less enchanted world. After centuries of debate, Muslim scholars arrived at what Halak calls great synthesis, a balance between reason and reasons. They rejected both extremes and adopted the middle position, as Islam called Muslims Ummat al-Wasat, where reason was understood as a tool that discovered moral reasons, while those reasons limit and guard reason. The source of moral reasons in Sharia is a cosmic moral order. The Quran's main message is not legal rules, but moral truths. Humans do not own the earth, they live under higher authority. Community creates responsibility, and morality is inseparable from human beings. The Quran, Sharia, and Muslim jurists all agreed that this moral domain is permanent, while laws must change with context, and this flexibility is achieved through ijtihad. And the last section of the last chapter is courses of action. Halak says that colonialism weakened Sharia because its strong moral focus clashed with modernity, which prioritizes politics and economics instead of morality. Even so, Sharia still survived today as a powerful moral system, even though its institutions were dismantled. This moral legacy offers Muslims two courses of action. First, Muslims can begin building small, morally grounded forms of governance from within their own societies. This requires creative and independent thinking. Historical moral ideas can guide how Muslims deal with education, economics, rights, social life, and the environment. Second, while doing this internal work, Muslims must also engage intellectually with the West. They should argue that morality should be the central concern of society. Muslims should also challenge the idea that one universal moral system fits all societies. Allah says that Muslims are not alone in this moral struggle. The shared concerns open the possibility of cooperation across cultures. And that is the end of this book. And now I'll see you with the next book.